Morning, everybody. We'll just wait 2 more minutes. I can see people still joining, so we'll give them the chance to jump in. Okay, that's 1 minute's grace. So I think that'll do. That'll do everyone. I can still see people trickling in, but that's fine. We'll crack on. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here this morning. I'm conscious of how precious everyone's time is midweek, especially this time in the morning. My name is Ben Donaldson. I'm a UC Solutions Architect at CPS. I specialize in Microsoft UC. So historically, Link Server, Skype for Business Server, OCS way back in the day, Skype for Business Online, and now Microsoft Teams. That said, obviously with my strong Microsoft background, I work for a Microsoft house. I've endeavored to make this session as agnostic as possible in terms of perspective. And the aim of it is, as it says on the screen, I really want to increase awareness around the kind of loaded question that gets thrown out around which is a better solution around Microsoft Teams and Zoom. Both products have matured over time. They're both very different products, and it's a difficult question to answer. And indeed, to throw a spoiler in, there is no right answer in terms of which is a better solution, Teams or Zoom. And you'll see why as we address the topic going forward. I'll cover the agenda on the screen, which is, as it reads, the comparison problem, how it's difficult to compare the two products, the compete areas, what they have in common, the overlapping feature sets, and then we'll look at those compete areas, the meetings, the room system and the introp between those meeting experiences, webinars, and telephony and PBX pieces. Those are the real three compete areas. And then we'll talk about a bit of data management, compliance, governance, and security towards the end. What I'm not going to spend today doing, because we simply don't have 3 days at our disposal, is to compare on a granular level the full feature sets and side-by-side comparison of how you can do something in a Teams meeting which you can't do in Zoom and vice versa, and the nuances of two things that appear similar in the first instance. We're not going to go to that level of detail. This is really comparing things at the product and offering level. And then the next step is to go away and obviously look at things on a more granular level through hands-on demonstration and those types of things. Okay, but I still think this will serve useful for the majority of people. Okay. So this will be common information to people. I envisage that most people on the call already have a fairly solid understanding of what Microsoft Teams and Zoom are. They're both very high-profile products. Both the flagship product in Microsoft portfolio at the moment is very much Teams. And Zoom has gained a high profile over the last 6 to 12 months in light of the current climate that we find ourselves in at the moment and the remote working scenarios. Teams has been around for a number of years now. It's the successor to Skype for Business Online, which in turn superseded Link Server and Office Communication Server. Offers workspace chat, callings, meetings, all the traditional unified comms capabilities that we'd expect. But it's Microsoft's first foray into providing the solution as a service only. So you can't get Teams as an on-premises server solution, for example, whereas historically you could get Skype and Link with on-prem versions, and they also offered a hosted version as part of Office 365 it was. And indeed, as of July next year, you won't be able to buy or utilize Skype for Business Online. It will only be Microsoft Teams that is available within the Microsoft portfolio for the UCaaS piece. Indeed, if you take out a new tenant now, it will be a Teams tenant. You can't get newly provisioned Skype anymore. It's only legacy environments and users and orgs that are currently able to make use of Skype for Business online. And then in contrast to the Teams piece, we have Zoom. In its first instance, Zoom was released as a video conferencing solution. It's been around for 2013, which is a surprise to most people, given that really it's come to the fore in the last 12 months. Like I said, predominantly because of the climate we find ourselves in, the remote workforce numbers have gone up, and Zoom have a very good and very aggressive marketing strategy, and they've gotten a lot of people's faces, they've made a lot of noise, and they make a good product. So it's no surprise that Zoom is right up there in terms of known names when it comes to video conferencing. And then since the release of Zoom and that initial approach to the meeting space and video conferencing, they've also expanded their product now to include telephony, webinar, room system hardware components as well. So that's created more and more overlap with Microsoft's own offering. So we get this question now quite regularly, which is better, Zoom or Teams? And it's really difficult to answer, primarily because, what aspect of the products are you talking about now? It's not strictly the meeting piece for Zoom anymore, although ordinarily when people ask that question, they're really talking about the meetings piece. And equally so, it varies by organization. There are an infinite number of scenarios, variables, and circumstances that can drastically change or take a strength of either of these products and nullify it or make it obsolete to a degree. And we'll talk about that through this presentation as well. But these are the two products that we're concerned with. Next slide. Okay, so if you go away and you Google, hey, what's better, Microsoft Teams or Zoom? It's potluck who you land with. Everyone is biased. Everyone has an opinion. I have an opinion. I'm obviously a Microsoft fanboy and I love Microsoft Teams and I think the product's great. I'm not bringing that into this conversation. I'm trying to see things from a neutral perspective. Equally so, you could go away and speak to somebody who sings the praises of Zoom, and rightly so. As I've already said, it's a solid, very mature meeting product. The quote on the screen there is from the first website that I Googled yesterday evening to find out which was better, Zoom or Teams. And the statement isn't wrong. To quote what's on the screen, if you're looking for a cost-effective conferencing webinar tool, look no further than Zoom. But if you want something more complete, then Teams is great. And it's not incorrect, it's not wrong, but it's really, really high level. And those types of blanket statements, they're good for starting points, but they certainly don't have any grain of truth in them that's applicable at an organizational level, okay? So it's a difficult question to answer because of that, and also because of some of the bullet points on the screen as well. You will speak to professionals, you will speak to organizations that use perhaps Teams or Zoom already. You'll speak to the vendors themselves, and everyone will have an opinion, and they won't be sat on the fence, and they'll sing the praises of one, and they'll perhaps not sing the praises or point out the downsides as they perceive them for the other. So you need to try and see through that and be conscious and mindful of opinion and people talking to you, even me now on this session, for example. They're different products at their core. One of the real problems around addressing the which is better scenario when we talk about meetings is Zoom was released as a meeting solution, built from the ground up as a meeting solution. Microsoft Teams is a much bigger product with a much larger interest, especially in the collaboration space. It's a bigger product with meetings sat as one of its pieces in the feature set. So it's a large product with meetings as part of it, whereas in contrast, Teams is a meetings product, right? So that makes it very difficult to compare the two, because things like licensing and cost, for example, how beneficial or which is better in terms of licensing and cost is all relative to how much you get out of the product and the other pieces that are available in it. It's a lot like the argument for Microsoft subscriptions now. What's better? Should I use an E3 or should I go to an E5? Is there value in that? I can't tell you that. you need to look at what's available within the E5 stack compared to Microsoft's E3 stack, and decide whether you'd get value from that. Measure the perceived benefits and the gain from that against the increased cost. And that is exactly the same problem that we have with Zoom versus Microsoft Teams from a meeting perspective. It's very difficult. They have different license models, which I alluded to, and they scale differently as well. When we get onto the licensing slides, you'll see that there are core licensing requirements to enable these services. To enable meeting for Zoom and to enable meetings for Teams, you need core licensing, but there are add-on licenses available as well. Now, how many of those add-on licenses you need varies, because again, the add-ons, they're not identical between vendors. You know, Microsoft have add-ons for certain scenarios, and Zoom have add-on for certain scenarios. With the Zoom add-ons, some of the stuff you get as part of those add-ons is baked into the Microsoft product by default, and vice versa. The stuff that you might buy add-ons for in Teams meetings is baked in to Zoom's meetings. So that makes it incredibly difficult to compare the two. And when you're looking at scale, if you need add-ons to unlock any functionality with either vendor, again, that can skew the numbers massively. So we need to be a bit forward thinking when it comes to licensing costs around either of these solutions, and we'll touch on that as well. Technical and business requirements. Here we're really thinking around governance, compliance, and regulatory and security. Again, can take the strengths of one product and blow it out the water completely. What's your longer term IT strategy? You know, perhaps you're looking at Zoom and Teams at the moment from a meeting perspective, but is there going to be consideration further down the line for telephony, where one product might be significantly stronger than the other? Perhaps from a meetings perspective, you've, after investigation, found that perhaps Teams and Zoom are pretty much on par from a meetings perspective. But down the line, if you weigh heavily towards Microsoft Teams phone system, then that has an impact on your decision now at this time around your meeting room system, because it would be nice to align all those capabilities to a single product. Existing services I kind of alluded to already. Do you have an existing Microsoft 365 subscription? Again, it complicates the decision-making process around either of these. User populace perception and awareness and education. Users have a lot to say. They're the ones that are using the solution. Again, their input is absolutely valid when you're trying to implement a meeting solution within an organization, and meeting usage scenarios, management and usage scenarios. So what are you going to be using the solution for? We'll talk, you know, like webinars, for example. Zoom is very strong at webinars, has a great portfolio of features, very granular, in contrast to Microsoft Teams live events. But if you're not going to make use of those, and there's no use cases for them, then it nullifies that strength to a degree, which we talked about. Okay, so it's very difficult to compare products, and it can only be done with the correct level of discovery at the organizational level. Nobody can preach to you about which is better. They can certainly assist you, and they can give you the right discovery questions and approach to help you understand what would be better, but it is absolutely user specific or organizational specific. When we compare the two products, it's again, I mentioned it's difficult. It's unfair to include things like the collaboration capabilities of Teams with its channels, teams, tabs, connectors, bots, etc., because there's not a good overlap of capability there. But there are three distinct areas of compete between Microsoft Teams and Zoom, and they're on the screen at the moment. The primary compete area is the meeting space. That's what Zoom came out as initially, and that's where the most aggressive compete is at the moment. And as I alluded to, when people say what's better, this or that, they're typically talking about that meetings piece. But as Zoom have released webinar capability and phone system capabilities this year, that's created two secondary areas of compete as well, which are due for consideration when you're thinking about the meetings piece. So we'll look at each of these areas. The meetings piece, we're not going to dive into what each solution can and can't do. The things on the screen, for example, under meetings, HD audio and video, the ability to message and chat, join from any device in a simple manner, schedule things using Calendar and Outlook, recording of meetings, being able to use dedicated hardware, have the right controls around the meeting experience. They're kind of de facto requirements, and both products do it. There are nuances and differences around how they do that, the user experience and the behavior, but for the sake of this comparison, they both do it very well. And webinars and phone systems equally so. When we're talking about webinars, we're talking about large scale events. So things change in terms of requirements from a regular meeting. So that's why in the middle column, we're talking about invitation and registration capabilities, polls, surveys, reporting and analytics, insights, large scale meetings with different requirements really. And then the phone system, the other secondary compete area, lit up by Zoom this year to compete with Microsoft. That ultimately looks at the ability of being able to replace your current phone system or integrate Zoom or Teams with that phone system so that you can make calls to and from it, and make calls to and from the public switch telephone network. And again, there's only so much you can do with a dial tone ultimately. So things like voicemail services, calling plans, getting the dial tone to the outside world, integration with a PBX, integration with third-party tools like contact centers, call recording and reporting, for example. Both products achieve those at the high level. Okay. So let's jump in and take a look at the meeting space in the first instance. So to light up meeting service within Zoom, you need core licensing. So the first thing you'll notice, and the takeaway from this slide, incidentally, we're not so interested in the monetary figures here. We can do the maths later on. The takeaway from this slide really is the fact that we're looking at a tiered licensing model with Zoom, which means, again, when people ask the question, what's better in terms of Teams or Zoom, licensing is one of the key factors. It feeds directly into the bottom line and the cost of the product and the cost of ownership, totally. And again, because you're working with a tiered licensing model in Zoom, you need to have a solid understanding and explore the requirements. Do your user discovery, your usage scenario discovery, and determine which in this tiered licensing model is most applicable to you as an organization. The top table here is the core licensing. You need something there, and we're going to ignore the basic version on the top line, but you need something from that table to light up your Zoom meeting service in the first instance. And you can see with a tiered licensing model, as you'd expect, the more you pay, the more you get. And that's true for the number of licenses you can have in your organization. So you can see that if you're using Pro, as soon as you start to scale beyond 10 users, it kind of auto tiers you up to having to use the business model for between 10 to 99 users. You can see there's storage capacity differences between Pro and Business compared to Enterprise, where you'll store your meeting recordings, for example. And then I haven't gone into the details, but on the right-hand side under the version comments, there's obviously an array of features that get added on to each tiered uplift as well. So in the first instance with Pro, you get the scheduling capabilities and reporting, etc. But there's no real admin interface or recording capabilities unless you step up to Business. And then equally so, when you step up to Enterprise, you get the things that you'd expect with an enterprise hosted service, like the bundled discounts and the reviews and dedicated managers, etc. So you'd need one of those things to light the service up in the first instance. And then underneath that, we have the add-on plans for Zoom meetings. So these, again, used to address use case scenarios that perhaps fall outside that core licensing. So you can use audio plans, which start at £100, but can scale to more. And that allows you to dial out from your meetings, which you wouldn't get in those current core versions. Now, I've worked with some organizations that have an unfathomable amount, and somehow they have this ingrained behavior that they use a lot of meeting dial out to pull people in. It's a habit in the organization. So that would impact here because you'd need audio plans and costs to do that. And that's based on the calling rates dictated by Zoom. So that £100 will get whittled down the more and more dial out that people do within your organization. Large meetings, $9.99 per user there. I should mention these are all per user costs per month. So you can see that you get a discount if you do it annually compared to a monthly cost. The large meetings just enables you on a per user basis to give that license to a user as an add-on And when they create a meeting, it can actually be 500 or 1,000 users, depending on which large meeting add-on they have, rather than the limitation that's in the top table there. And cloud storage, there's 1 gig cloud storage for Business and Pro. If you need more than that, you'd have to pay for it as an add-on. So there really is a lot more to what first appears to be on the face of things for enabling Zoom meetings. But like I said, takeaway is the add-ons and the tiered licensing model. In contrast, when we look at Microsoft Teams, this is very much a flat licensing model. If you have Teams, you have Teams. That's pretty much the sum of it. And that comes with every single Office 365 subscription that you can imagine. So that comes with all your academic licensing, your frontline worker SKUs. If you have standard business or business professional SKU, you get Teams with that. All the enterprise plans, Microsoft 365 and all the e-plans, you get Teams. And are there any differences in the Teams flavor that you get? No, you get Teams. That's the sum of the parts. The single difference is live events. Live events doesn't exist for business plans, and we'll talk about that when we get to live events. So you can see that in terms of scope for change, because you could tier up and down within the Zoom meetings space in terms of licensing. Strictly, you're not going to tier up and down. There's no scope to it. It's a flat licensing model from a Teams perspective. And most importantly, a large number of organizations are already invested in one of those subscriptions that I referenced previously, which means they already have Teams at their disposal. Again, there are add-ons available relevant to the meeting space. Audio conferencing on a per user basis can be assigned to a user. When that user creates a meeting invite, it will have a dial-in number on the bottom of it that allows people to call in. Without that license, it would just be a meeting that's joinable over the internet or over IP with a click here to join link, no actual telephone number. So again, consideration there. And communication credits. On the previous slide, they're referred to as audio plans for Zoom. In the Microsoft world, they're communication credits. So again, allows you to dial out of meetings based on Microsoft's calling rate card, how much you pay per minute to any given country. And also allows you to dial in on toll-free numbers like 0800 numbers, where if you obtain an 0800 number for your meeting scenario and a user dials in on that, you'll put the cost for that in their stead by using communication credits. So again, less more around the granular details around the cost and what licenses are required, more an awareness around with the Microsoft piece, it's a flat core license with add-ons. With Zoom, it's a tiered license with add-ons. In both those tables for products, there were free offerings. We won't linger on these because strictly speaking, these aren't fit for enterprise. They're not fit for business to a degree. You can imagine as you look through that list there, Zoom Basic on the right, for example. I know the reaction of senior personnel and executives where I work if the meeting was to shut down after 40 minutes is not acceptable. And equally so on the Teams side, there's no recording available within the Teams free offering. But both these products, they've been invaluable to organizations as interim solutions in the current climate, where we had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction where people had to work from home. And while people kind of explored and did the necessary discovery to perhaps extend their meeting capabilities to the home office, these products in front of us now certainly proved useful in that regard. But they are stopgaps and they are useful for trial and explanatory purposes, but they're certainly not enterprise ready per se. Okay. And I think that's kind of the end of the first compete piece, the meeting rooms piece. Next up is the room system piece. Oh, in fact, it's not. This falls into the meeting room compete piece as well. So complementing meetings and still part of that compete scenario are room systems. So room systems are, as it suggests on the screen, purpose-built hardware solutions from various vendors like Poly, Logitech, Lenovo, HP, Crestron. They make hardware specifically for use and tailored for meeting room scenarios. And it's tailored and created for use specifically with either Teams room systems or Zoom rooms. So there's two different flavors. If you Googled it, you'd see an array of vendors that make hardware for Zoom and make hardware for Teams. And indeed, directly from the Teams website or the Zoom website, there'll be direct links to certified hardware and devices that they recommend for their solutions as room systems. The room systems that you use will directly reflect your meeting solution choice. So if you use Teams, you're going to use Teams room systems. If you use Zoom, you're going to use Zoom rooms, for example. They range from a single device. If you imagine a small huddle room, you know, the traditional conferencing spider phones that you have, they range from that right the way up to perhaps, you know, a top level exec boardroom that's got touch interface, multi-screen, a mic array in the ceiling, multiple camera count, for example. They go from one end of the spectrum to the other in both complexity and cost. What's on the screen is licensing for those. So you will need to license those devices. So you need to license the Teams room system at £11.30 and the Zoom room for £39 a month. Doesn't include any hardware. So again, when we're looking at initial cost of investment or indeed ongoing cost of investment, you've got this recurring license cost for the Teams room itself or the Zoom room itself, either or. And then you have the initial laydown capital investment of the hardware itself. Zoom do offer hardware as a service, so you can imagine that that might be beneficial in terms of staging or gradual rollout of room systems, for example. And they also offer professional services. Microsoft very much go through their partner system for implementation of services and procurement of kit. Point of note with the Teams room system is the idea behind that license from a Teams room perspective is to negate wastage of a ordinary Office 365 license. So in days gone by, if you had a device that needed a Teams license, you perhaps consume one of your E3 or E5 licenses, solely for getting Teams capability on that device. Those days are gone, and Microsoft released the Teams Room license that under the bonnet only has the necessary components embedded in it, like Microsoft Intune, for example, for managing the device, Skype for Business and Teams for enabling the services. So it's a dialed down Teams Room license. That means you're not wasting or unnecessarily consuming an E5 or E3 license as an example. Okay. Obviously, the costs for the associated hardware vary. There's a lot out there in the ecosystem for all of those vendors that I mentioned previously, and bulk discounts exist with them depending on how many you're deploying, for example. So again, lots of unknowns. And going back to the, the initial question around which is better. Well, if you're deploying a meeting room solution and you've got many, many room systems that you're looking to deploy, the cost when totaled up, one solution versus another can be drastically different. Devices, room systems, and things like desk phones and headsets are the single biggest hidden cost when it comes to meetings and telephony components in UC solutions. Okay. And then the final point of note to kind of close out this particular compete area is meeting room interoperability. So this is changing at the moment. The landscape for interop is changing. So historically, a Zoom room would only talk to a Zoom room. A Teams room would only talk to a Teams room, for example. And this was a problem, especially if you'd invested heavily in, I don't know, Cisco environment historically, where Cisco kit is expensive. You've deployed it in numbers around your bazaars as part of your meeting room solution. And now perhaps you're going towards Teams or you're going towards Zoom. Well, these two solutions on the screen, they allow for interoperability between their respective vendors. So Cloud Video Interop solution isn't strictly provided by Microsoft. It's provided by Poly, Pexip, BlueJeans, or Cisco. They're the certified providers of Cloud Video Interop. And using their Interop solution, you can ensure that your Teams room systems will talk natively to other third-party systems, so other standards-based video conferencing solutions. And the same is true for Zoom, only they call it a conferencing room connector. You use the conferencing room connector in conjunction with your Zoom room, and hey presto, you've got the ability to talk to other third-party standards-based video conferencing solutions. So this again feeds directly into what your requirements are. You know, Joe Blogs, who's saying that X solution is better than Y solution, doesn't know what your current posture is in terms of your meeting room scenario. He doesn't know, or he or she doesn't know, whether you need to invest in this particular area. Now, this requirement will wane slightly going forward. given that Zoom, Cisco, and Teams have all committed to delivering native interop between their respective room systems. So that will obviously affect the cost of adoption going forward. But it's nice to see that the vendors are playing together in the first instance, and we're going to have that native interop. Other standards-based video solutions, you would still need to use one of these interoperability solutions. Okay, and that kind of completes the meeting room compete scenario. So we've got our core licensing that's a consideration, our add-on licensing that's a consideration, what we put in our rooms, and then whether we need any interop between those. Now, they're all common areas that both Zoom and Microsoft compete in, and you'd need to weigh up the pros, cons, costs, features, benefits, pitfalls, etc. for those 4 areas when we're talking about the meeting room compete. Our next compete area is webinars. It's just a single slide on this. I mentioned it at the beginning. Webinars are glorified meetings to an extent. As it says on the screen, the functionality, scale, and user experience during a webinar is different from a normal meeting scenario, right? We're after things like insights, invitation management, registrations, being able to see if people are focusing on the screen or whether they've minimized the session to the background, for example, whether you're their focus point. Feedback, all automated. So that type of functionality is best served through a dedicated large-scale event solution. In the Microsoft world, that's done through Teams Live Events. In the Zoom world, that's done through Zoom Webinars. So Teams Live Events is included with Microsoft subscriptions, as I mentioned before, other than Business Standard and Business Pro subscriptions. But if you've got Microsoft 365 or any e-subscription, then you have live events already. And that will enable you to scale meetings up to a large event scenario, address 10,000 people, provide Q&A, that type of stuff. Zoom Webinars is a standalone separate product. So whereas Teams Live Events is baked in to the 365 subscription and Teams offering, Zoom Webinars stands alone completely. You could just buy Zoom Webinars on its own if you want. Has tiered licensing again, starting from £32 for 100, goes right the way up to 50,000. And at that point, you're looking at separating with in excess of £5,000 a month just for that one capability. But again, that might be applicable to you. It is very strong. It provides greater depth capabilities in contrast to live events natively. So things like email reminders, post-event surveys, social media streaming, PayPal integration if you're doing a session that you want people to pay for. Those types of things natively. A lot of that is achievable within live events, but it's a slightly more complicated looking picture in as much as you lean on third parties and integration, for example. So Zoom is very, very strong in that regard. But this is a classic example, and this isn't strictly true for Zoom webinars, but this is a classic example of justifying that it's not strictly one or the other. You know, we are a Microsoft house. I use Teams every day. I attend 5, 6, 7, upwards of 10 meetings every day using Teams, but you're not watching this meeting right now, this session right now on a Teams live event. I don't know what it's called, GoToMeeting, I think, because of the capabilities that our marketing team and those involved in these types of sessions require. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not an either or scenario. You can use Teams for your meetings, and you can use something like Zoom, or indeed another, I mentioned at the beginning, this isn't strictly specific to Zoom, or another solution for your webinar piece, okay? But obviously needs to be considered if you're looking at the moment primarily focused on what your meeting room solutions should be. These things have an impact on that. The third or the other secondary compete area is telephony. So Microsoft are very, very strong in telephony. They have a great background. Link Server 2010, when Microsoft first became a mature telephony platform, everything learned from that point onwards 10 years ago through Link, Skype for Business Service, Skype Online, and now Teams, that their experience has been built up over a very long period of time now. So they're very good in that area. In contrast, Zoom Phone is only a number of months old. It was released this year. So the verdict is very much still out in terms of the solution as a whole on Zoom Phone, the pitfalls, and anything associated to great performance or poor performance indeed. it's still much undecided at this time. The idea behind telephony, obviously, when we look at it from a Zoom and Teams perspective, is to extend those solutions to include PBX integration or PSTN calling. I mentioned at the beginning, ultimately the ability to replace your phone system. And again, we haven't broken down what one can do and what the other can, because there are an inordinate amount, excessive amount of capabilities. Some look like they do the same thing in the first instance between Zoom and Teams, but when you look closer, they behave slightly differently. We'd have a very complex matrix if we were to do a side-by-side comparison. But the points on the screen really are kind of just really high-level points that have been pulled out and expectations around de facto requirements for a dial tone. So voicemail services, the ability to play greetings and have calls automatically distributed to agents in hunt group type fashion, to be able to report on analytics, utilization of calls, all those things are fairly standard expectations around PSTN dial tone. Both vendors have certified devices. We mentioned Teams rooms already. The same is true for desk phones. Both vendors have certified desk phones, indeed from those same types of vendors, Poly, Yealink, for example. The idea is to provide an enterprise-grade phone system, and I mentioned already that the ability is there from both platforms to integrate with your current PBX platform, whether that's in a Cisco, a Avaya, Mitel, for example, and to be able to integrate with the PSTN. As well as that, third-party integration. So if you have a contact center solution at the moment, for example, or you're going to procure a newer one, being able to integrate that to Zoom or Teams phone system. Contact center is a good example of what neither of these systems are. Contact centers have been around for years. They have niche requirements like the ability for a supervisor to listen in on a conversation, rest breaks, custom absence breaks, the ability for supervisors to whisper in an agent's ear and the customer not hear them. Those types of things, they're not within the feature sets of either of these two products we're looking at now, but it's important that those contact center products can integrate with these phone system pieces. So very complex environment. How do we go about lighting up? In fact, before we move on, the thing to call out with phone system really, phone system and Zoom Phone, is the connection method, how we go about connecting to the public switch telephone network. And you'll see when we go onto the licensing slide, there are calling plans for both these solutions. A calling plan is very much like a mobile phone tariff. You pay per user, fixed cost, you get X amount of minutes, and hey presto, you don't have to worry about managing any on-prem equipment, for example. It's hosted completely by these providers. They connect you to the PSTN. You just concern yourself with buying the right calling plan and assigning it to users. But equally so, you can see the top bullet point there, direct routing and bring your own carrier. Direct routing is Microsoft flavor. Bring your own carrier is the Zoom Phone flavor. Both these solutions enable you to use your existing PSTN connection. So if you have BT lines or Virgin lines coming into your office at the moment, and you're in a contract with them for the next 3 years, you can't just cancel that and go to calling plans with one of these two. You'd get penalized. Equally so, they probably offer more favorable calling rates than what the calling plans would from either Microsoft or Zoom. So there's value in staying with that current provider. Well, it's direct routing and bring your own carrier capabilities that allow us to do that. Connect either of these systems to your current PSTN or telco provider. It's also those solutions that allow us to integrate with your current on-premises phone system. So you can have cost-free calling between your current Cisco, Avaya, or Mitel with Zoom or Teams. You can dial by extension. It allows us to use analog devices in conjunction with Teams and Zoom. And it also allows us to use things that I mentioned earlier, contact centers and other third-party solutions. With calling plans, where you're buying the equivalent of a mobile phone tariff for your users on either of these, you don't get any of that functionality because you have no connection to your on-prem environment. It's completely hosted. Okay. This slide talks, again, don't take away figures. The takeaway from the slide is really visibility of what's potentially could be included from a licensing perspective when we look at phone system for either of these. So with Microsoft Teams phone system, you get phone system included with E5. If you're not on E5, then you'd need to buy that phone system license that you can see for £6 there and assign that to your users. That enables the PBX capabilities, the phone capabilities. Then beyond that, you need to think about how you're going to connect them to the telephone network and enable them for making calls. And I mentioned that could be one of these calling plans, business voice, domestic calling 120 or domestic and international, one of those calling plans, or perhaps none of those, and instead deploying a session border controller on premises and using your existing connection that we talked about previously. Other costs or add-on licensing that can come out the woodwork with Teams phone system is common area phone. Again, similar to how Microsoft made a room license available to reduce or negate wastage from assigning an E5 or E3. Same is true for common area phone licenses. If you deploy a Teams phone, then you'd need to assign it with a Teams license. Common area phone license is the cheapest way to do that. And it's very similar for Zoom. Only you buy one of their calling plan licenses and assign that to a user. And again, they've got some add-ons at the bottom there around procuring additional numbers and international calling capabilities. These last two slides I want to touch on, and we'll rattle over these because I'm conscious we've only got 4 minutes left, and I've seen some questions come in around data management and security, but I won't linger on them. Instead, just be very mindful that Zoom did shine a spotlight on themselves from a security perspective over recent months. They scaled very quickly. They're nowhere near as mature as Microsoft in terms of the whole security, governance, and compliance space, as you can see from these slides that we're looking at now. And so certain areas of industry are very susceptible and have very strict guidelines in these spaces. So be conscious of that when you're considering one solution or the other. The bottom part of that slide, incidentally, is the compliance piece for Microsoft Teams, not Zoom. Okay, so I guess the takeaway points really is, if you haven't already guessed, there's no right or wrong answer around which is more applicable or more favorable for any given organization when you're looking at Teams. It's moved away from just being a meeting solution now, the Zoom and Teams piece. It now includes perhaps future telephony aspirations and webinars, for example. So there's larger consideration in there. Some of the key deciding factors are those that are on the screen, for example. If you already have a Microsoft subscription, you ultimately need to justify buying a Zoom subscription purely for meetings. Is the feature gap really that big between Zoom meetings and Microsoft meetings? Do you see enough tangible benefit to justify that cost? No is the answer, but then that's my opinion. And that shouldn't be your preconceived opinion. It shouldn't form your preconceived opinion just because it's mine. Do you have existing hardware investment? We talked about interop requirements. Think beyond the immediate. So if you're just looking at meetings now, think about telephony and webinars. Also think about cost of scaling in terms of add-on licenses. Don't just do the like-for-like comparison, because you'll get burnt at a future date. Consider your users. Consider the usage scenarios that you're currently using. Form your own opinions. I mentioned that everyone is biased. Everyone has an opinion, and that opinion is for a reason. Consider your security posture, which I mentioned at the end. And know that the starting strengths of a product can be diminished through use cases. I mentioned that with the webinars. I'll openly say that Zoom is a great webinar solution natively and out the box compared to Teams live events. But Teams live events, you've probably already got if you have Teams. So if you're not using any of that great functionality that's available in Zoom webinars, or indeed can live without it, again, that diminishes the strength slightly and changes that comparison significantly. And then the final point, which I can't emphasize enough, is it's not apples for apples when we're comparing these products. It's apples for oranges. You need to consider the fact that Teams is more than a meetings, webinar, and telephony product. It has all those other facets to it around channels, teams, apps, bots, connectors, AI, automation. It is the evolution of Microsoft's unified comms platform. And they tried to call it intelligent comms and rebranded at one point, simply because of the level of intelligence, automation, and big data that now feeds into Microsoft Teams. So it's important that we maintain perspective on that. And I think that's everything. I did have a slide for Q&A, but I'm conscious that we've run out of time. So I won't keep people beyond the 45 minutes. If you do have any follow-up questions, or indeed you want to chew the fat, have a soundboard conversation around anything related to Microsoft Teams or unified comms in general, I'm happy to talk about that. It doesn't have to be what we've talked about today. Get in contact with the details that are on the screen. I hope, if nothing else, it's created a level of awareness or improved upon it for you if you're looking at that compete scenario at the moment. And I wish you the very best of the rest of your day. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you, everyone.